After listening in a school for about 5 years, a school I was a partner with in Michigan, I was really curious about how the kids heard in the space of school. And given that curiosity, I was able to engage with fourth graders who I had worked with previously in an inquiry the year before, as well as first graders who were new to the school, and worked independently in each of the classes to do a series of different read-alouds, focusing first on the way that we look around the world. It's made up of different sorts of shapes and colors and lines, to then help them think more abstractly in some ways about sound and how our world is also made up of a series of sounds as well as things that we see. And so we talked about different things like silence and noise, and we talked about the ambient soundscapes of the heaters and vents in the school, as well as different projectors and things like that they would hear. Students also noted often the eraser and then a brushing of that off the desk that their peers would do. And we talked about the different spaces of the school and how they had different sounds as well, and how some sounds were similar or different. And after working separately with each of the schools, we brought them together, the two teachers and I, and asked them to kind of map out those spaces that they thought were important in thinking about the question of what sounds are important for a new visitor or a new person to the school community to really hear. And so they each chose 3 different locations that they would draw or they would write words about things they hoped to capture. And then they went out the following day in pairs. So every pair was a first and a fourth grader with an iPad, where they were just using an audio recorder. There was no video on the iPads themselves, though several of the children were wearing GoPros. And they made their way through different areas of the school in small groups, recording different sorts of sounds. Everything from caterpillars walking on brick walls, which they later reflected upon listening to their recordings, didn't really have a real sound, to lifting one another up to move across the glider and have one child record that, or pushing each other on swings, or having peers run back and forth on the gym floor, squeaking their shoes, or doing jumping jacks to try and emulate some of the sounds that they understood to exist in those sorts of spaces. And I was really interested in listening back with them about those sounds that they had recorded, to hear what they were noticing and what their intention was in the different recordings they did. So for one group in particular, they recorded a water fountain, and so they wanted to record not just the water, but the sound of the hum of the motor, because that was this familiar sound for them. Another thing that was really interesting in listening back with them was even how they noticed how quiet they got when they entered into the space of the office, which was very much an adult space, more so than one for the children. Yeah, I actually think for me, one of the things that was really interesting was both listening to the sounds that they heard and that made up their world of the school, and also how they came to it so much more readily than their teachers did, and how their teachers really didn't hear in the space in the ways that the children seemed to have a lot of ease. Like they seemed to really slip into it in a way that working with prospective teachers previously listening, or working with college students and trying to listen to ambient soundscapes, the kids knew it, they understood it. And so I was coming to this and trying to develop my own like ethnographic ear in a space I had been listening to for a long time and in. And I think that in some ways I was really surprised with how easily the children had come to it, which is always disappointing to myself because I try to think that kids like are the best and the best people to be around. But I think that they were really into it. They could just readily name things, both the first graders and the fourth graders, and they tended to sound in ways of drawing speakers with like sound waves coming off of them in the hallway, and talking about announcements that are made, but then also tending to these small sounds of the eraser, or having washrooms in the classrooms and the flush of a toilet. And so these sounds that make up their everyday that perhaps as teachers we either hear as noise or we hear as quiet, that kids really attune to those in a different sort of way. I think that the sound work for me is very exploratory in a lot of different ways. I think I've tried to do a lot of reading outside of education, because I think this has really been explored in lots of different ways, from geography to sound studies itself to writing and rhetoric and composition. And so kind of melding all of these different areas of study and bringing those together to really engage with kind of a critical sociocultural and sociopolitical sense of sound, to hear how kids hear in this kind of political era, especially in the states where I was doing this work following the 2016 presidential election, versus I think also attuning myself to like, I'm in a new city now, and so how am I hearing differently? And what are the sounds of Toronto, and how do those differ than the other places that I've lived? And so I think that it's always about kind of checking myself and checking the students in some ways to try and get to some of that thinking. And so I think that it's playing with methods and it's playing with theory and trying to see what fits to make sense of this. So most recently with this data, I have been thinking both about like the pervasiveness of adults in the background of the recording, where adults are always asking children like, okay, like now we have to move on to this next location that we're going to go record in. And how even in this kind of free-flowing, open event happening in school with this recording, it's still monitored by adults, it's still surveilled, it's still confined in some ways. And then at the same time, taking the maps that they have taken, playing with that a bit, and creating, so sonifying the data, so creating tables, numbering the items, both objects, naming the objects, counting the words, putting these into different sorts of tables, and then actually playing with a tool called musical algorithms to hear what they've mapped and to hear how that can help me to make sense of what they've done differently. So one of the things that happens is a lot of objects or words appear just once. And so in musical algorithms, this results in having lots of staccato short sounds, which aren't pleasant to hear as a listener. And I was finding myself wishing that I had some of these longer notes that would occur if many children wrote down sounds of the cafeteria. And ultimately what it made me think about was how I was really silencing kids again by wishing for that, and how my adult ears were again quite different than the numerous different sounds that kids really picked up. I think part of it's just learning how to play with different materials yourself. So I was really fortunate to do like a week-long workshop at the University of Texas at Austin, where we engaged with different like Zoom recorders and different boom mics and things like that, and learning how to play with those sounds once they were captured. I think also just it takes a lot of work. I feel like the work that I just did with these first and fourth graders is hopefully something that can help to launch a broader study with a group of kids, maybe more over a sustained amount of time, where I'm new to the space in listening to and can maybe hear differently than them. I think also just reading really broadly across sound studies is really, really important. A lot of the things that I'm interested in have been taken up in different places already. And so I think recognizing that while it might be newer to education, that there's a lot of work happening in other spaces that we can borrow from and learn from to continue to develop both methods but also theories around it. I don't know if it necessarily has to be a long-term engagement. I think that sound is so like temporal and spatial anyways that we're always dealing with an archive when we have sounds that we're listening back to. But I think that in moving forward as like a researcher for myself and thinking about how to resound the field, I would say that it's a long-term project maybe for myself more so than at a specific site or with a specific project or inquiry, but thinking about how sound is ever present across the different inquiries, and how that can help me to make sense of what I'm hearing and what I'm understanding in terms of the embodied multimodal listening or different components like that too.